The gates of Harding Correctional stood behind Marcus Webb like a mouth that had finally decided to spit him out after 12 years of chewing. He carried everything he owned in a canvas bag that weighed maybe 10 pounds, stood on a rural Virginia road at dawn, and thought about the daughter who'd been 6 years old the last time he'd held her and was now 18 and hadn't answered a single one of his letters in the past 3 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The parole officer had given him an address in Ashmont Ridge, the town where Marcus had grown up working his father's lumber yard, where he'd made the mistakes that cost him 12 years and destroyed everything he'd built. His father Samuel had died 8 years into Marcus's sentence, a heart attack that took him while he was alone in the office of Webb Timber, the business he'd run for 40 years. Marcus had learned about it through a brief letter from his sister Claire, who'd written that their father had left the lumber yard to Marcus in his will but that nobody expected him to do anything with it since it had been abandoned and was probably condemned by now. Marcus hitched a ride with a trucker heading through Ashmont Ridge, sat in silence watching familiar landscape roll past, seeing how 12 years had changed what he remembered. Some buildings were gone, replaced with nothing. Others had been converted to new purposes or simply left to rot. The truck dropped him at the edge of town where Millwood Road curved toward the lumber yard, and Marcus walked the final mile carrying his bag and the weight of everything he'd lost. Webb Timber sat on 7 acres at the end of Millwood Road, bordered by pine forest on 3 sides and the county highway on the 4th. From a distance, it looked almost the way Marcus remembered, the main shed where lumber had been stored and cut, the office building his grandfather had built in the 50s, the equipment barn where forklifts and saws had been maintained. Up close, the decay was evident. Windows broken, doors hanging open, graffiti marking walls that had once been kept meticulously clean. The chain-link fence that had surrounded the property hung in sections, cut or torn down by salvagers who'd picked over whatever equipment Samuel hadn't sold before dying. The gates stood open, padlock long since removed, and Marcus walked through them feeling like he was entering a graveyard where everything he'd known was buried. The office building was unlocked, its doors swinging on rusted hinges. Inside, the space where his father had run the business for 4 decades showed signs of weather damage and abandonment. Water stains marked the ceiling where the roof had leaked, papers scattered across the floor, filing cabinets hanging open and mostly empty. A photograph still hung on one wall, faded but recognizable, Samuel Webb standing in front of a loaded lumber truck in what must have been the 80s, his expression serious, his posture suggesting pride in work well done. Marcus stood in his father's office trying to reconcile memory with reality, trying to process that this decay represented the end of something Samuel had built from nothing, had maintained through recessions and competition and the slow death of small timber operations. The business had survived until Marcus's conviction, had limped along for a few years after, and had finally given up when Samuel's heart did. He found his father's desk still there, its surface warped by moisture but intact. The drawers were mostly empty except for one that held personal items Samuel had apparently kept separate from business records. Inside, Marcus found a leather journal, his father's handwriting filling pages dated from the year of Marcus's conviction through the week before Samuel's death. The entries were sparse, matter-of-fact, the kind of writing Samuel had always done, recording facts without dwelling on emotions. But reading through them, Marcus could trace his father's slow defeat. Orders declining, equipment breaking down, the realization that running the yard alone at 72 was becoming impossible. The final entry, dated 3 days before Samuel died, simply read, "Close the gates today. No more orders coming. Told myself I'd reopen when Marcus came home, but I'm tired and my heart's not right. Let him decide what becomes of this place." Marcus sat in the broken office reading his father's journal, understanding that Samuel had kept the lumber yard nominally alive for 8 years after Marcus went to prison, had held on as long as his body allowed, had died still hoping his son would return and resurrect what had been lost. The weight of that hope, that faith Marcus had never earned, settled onto shoulders that were already carrying more guilt than seemed sustainable. He spent the afternoon exploring the property, cataloging the damage and taking stock of what remained. The main storage shed was mostly empty, just scraps of lumber and debris. The cutting equipment had been sold or salvaged, leaving only the concrete pads where machinery had stood. The equipment barn held a few tools nobody had bothered stealing, rusty and outdated but potentially functional. But it was what Marcus found in the back corner of the property, in a section that had been used for storing specialty hardwoods, that made him stop and reconsider everything. A shipping container sat there, newer than anything else on the property, secured with a heavy-duty lock that looked recently maintained. Marcus had no memory of this container from before his incarceration, which meant Samuel had added it sometime in the intervening years. He tried the keys from his father's key ring, finding one that fit the container's lock. The mechanism turned smoothly despite years of weather exposure, suggesting regular maintenance even after Samuel's death. Marcus pulled open the heavy door, stepping back as air that had been sealed inside rushed out. Inside, the container was climate-controlled, a dehumidifier still running on power from a solar panel Marcus noticed on the container's roof. The space was packed with lumber, but not ordinary lumber. Rare hardwoods, exotic species, wood that was beautiful and valuable and carefully stored with the kind of attention that suggested significant investment. Marcus stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dimmer light, seeing walnut and cherry, tiger maple and bird's eye maple, pieces of wood that were worth hundreds of dollars per board foot. There were also more exotic species, purple heart and paddock, zebrawood and figured koa, woods that Marcus remembered his father talking about but rarely stocking because they were too expensive for most customers. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A ledger sat on a shelf inside the container, Samuel's handwriting documenting acquisitions over 8 years. He'd been systematically purchasing rare hardwoods, investing what money the lumber yard generated into stock that would appreciate rather than depreciate, building inventory that might have value even if the business itself died. The ledger showed purchases totaling over $200,000, money Samuel had apparently buried in wood rather than banks. The final entry in the ledger was dated 2 months before Samuel's death, 50 board feet figured walnut, $12,000. For Marcus, when he comes home. Build something that matters. Marcus stood in the climate-controlled container surrounded by lumber his father had spent 8 years collecting, reading a message that made his throat tight. Samuel hadn't just kept the business alive, he'd converted it into something different, into stored value and future possibility, into a gift for a son who'd thrown away everything they'd built together. He climbed out of the container as evening settled over Ashmont Ridge, the Virginia humidity thick with the smell of pine and approaching rain. The lumber yard was a ruin, the business was dead, but his father had left him something that went beyond the property deed. He'd left intention, had created possibility that extended past his own death. Marcus called his sister Claire from the office phone, which somehow still had a dial tone. She answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who wasn't sure what to say to a brother she hadn't seen in 12 years. Marcus. Claire. I'm at the lumber yard. Silence stretched between them, years of distance and complicated family dynamics making simple conversation difficult. How is it? She finally asked. Worse than I expected and better than I had any right to hope for. Dad left me something. A lot of something. Marcus paused. I need to know about Emma. You're the only one who kept in touch with her. Is she okay? Another pause, longer this time. She's in Richmond. Working as a barista, taking community college classes. She stopped reading your letters 3 years ago, said it was too painful to maintain connection with someone who wasn't present. The words hit exactly as hard as Marcus had known they would. Does she know I'm out? I told her last week. She said she needed time to decide if she wanted to see you. That's fair. More fair than I deserve. Marcus looked around the office where his father had worked until his body gave out. Tell her I'm at the lumber yard if she wants to find me. Tell her I understand if she doesn't. After hanging up, Marcus made a bed from cardboard and the sleeping bag he'd carried from prison, cleared space in the office that was least damaged by weather. It wasn't comfortable, probably violated parole conditions about having proper housing, but it was his in a way nothing had been his for 12 years. He lay awake most of the night thinking about the wood in the container, about the value Samuel had accumulated and hidden, about the fact that his father had spent his final years converting a dying business into stored potential. The lumber alone was worth probably $500,000 if sold to the right buyers, enough to start over, to build something new, to maybe prove to his daughter that he was more than the man who'd gone to prison when she was 6. But there was something else gnawing at Marcus, a question about why Samuel had been so secretive about the hardwood collection, why he'd locked it in a climate-controlled container rather than just storing it in the main shed. The lumber yard's abandonment meant anyone could have walked the property, could have discovered what was hidden if they'd been looking. Around 2 in the morning, Marcus gave up on sleep and went back to the container, using a flashlight to examine it more carefully. That's when he found it, a false floor at the back of the container, cleverly constructed to look like solid flooring but actually hiding a space beneath. He pried up the false floor, finding underneath it something that made his pulse quicken. Documents, sealed in waterproof containers. Business records that went back decades, but also something else. Deeds to properties Marcus didn't know his father owned, including mineral rights to land adjacent to the lumber yard. Financial statements showing accounts in Samuel's name that held significant money, hundreds of thousands of dollars that had never been part of the lumber yard's business accounts. And at the bottom of the hidden space, a letter addressed to Marcus in his father's careful handwriting, dated 1 week before Samuel's death. Marcus, if you're reading this, you found what I hoped you'd find. The hardwood is real, is valuable, is yours to use as you see fit. But it's also camouflage for what matters more, the documents and the truth they represent. 30 years ago, I did something I'm not proud of. Made a deal with people who weren't honest, helped them move money through the lumber yard's accounts in exchange for a percentage that let me expand the business. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd stop once I'd built something stable. But you can't stop with people like that. They own you once you start. I got out eventually, kept the money I'd made, invested it carefully so it would have value if something happened to me. But those people didn't forget. They've been waiting for an opportunity to reclaim what they think I stole from them. Your conviction gave them that opportunity. They thought with you in prison, they could pressure me into returning their investment. I refused. Told them the money was converted to assets they couldn't touch, that I'd hidden it where they'd never find it. They've been watching this property for 8 years, waiting to see if you'd come back, if you'd find what I hid. They're dangerous, Marcus. They're patient. And they believe you know where I put their money. The truth is, the money in those offshore accounts came from legitimate lumber sales I made over 30 years, from investments I made carefully and legally after I stopped working with them. It's yours by right. But they'll claim it's theirs, will use intimidation or worse to try to take it. Use the hardwood to build something legitimate. Use the hidden money to protect yourself and Emma if you need to. But be careful. These people don't forgive, and they don't forget. I died before they could make me talk. That's probably for the best. Now the burden falls to you. I'm sorry for that. But I trust you to be smarter and stronger than I was. Your father Marcus sat in the dark container reading his father's confession, understanding that the lumber yard hadn't just been abandoned, it had been watched, had been left alone because whoever Samuel had betrayed was waiting for exactly this moment, for Marcus to return and lead them to what they believed they were owed. The morning that had started with release from 12 years in prison had just become infinitely more complicated. Marcus had inherited not just property and valuable hardwood, but a conflict Samuel had kept secret until death, a fight with dangerous people who thought they had legitimate claim to money Samuel insisted was earned honestly. The container stood in the darkness, its secrets revealed, its burden transferred. Marcus Webb had walked out of prison that morning expecting to find ruins and regret. Instead, he'd found his father's final gift and final warning, stored lumber and hidden documents, possibility and danger wrapped together in ways that couldn't be separated. The lumber yard waited in the Virginia night, its decay hiding value, its abandonment masking surveillance. Whatever came next would determine not just whether Marcus could rebuild his relationship with his daughter, but whether he'd survive long enough to try. Marcus spent the first week documenting everything, photographing the hardwood inventory, scanning the documents his father had hidden, uploading copies to cloud storage in case the originals were destroyed or stolen. He worked methodically, the discipline learned from 12 years of prison routine translating to careful preparation for whatever was coming. Because something was definitely coming. His father's letter had made that clear. The lumberyard's isolation felt different now that Marcus knew it was being watched. Every car that slowed on the county highway, every sound in the surrounding pine forest, carried potential threat. He installed motion sensors using money from the small amount of cash Samuel had left in the office safe, created sight lines that would make it harder for someone to approach without being seen. Old habits from before prison, when Marcus had made his living in ways that required awareness of who might be watching. That was what had sent him to prison, a deal that went wrong, drugs moved through the lumber yard in shipments of lumber, money that seemed easy until federal agents showed up with warrants and evidence that couldn't be explained away. Marcus had taken the plea deal, had refused to name his partners, had served his 12 years believing at least he'd protected the lumber yard from being seized as proceeds of crime. He'd never known his father had been involved in similar activities decades earlier, had never suspected Samuel's expansion of the business had been funded by anything other than hard work. On the 8th morning after his arrival, a truck pulled into the lumber yard's lot, newer and cleaner than anything else in Ashmont Ridge. 2 men got out, both wearing work clothes that were too clean, their posture suggesting they weren't here to buy lumber. Marcus watched from the office window, his hand finding the knife he'd started carrying, his body tensing with familiar readiness. The older man was maybe 60, weathered face and hard eyes, the kind of person who'd spent his life getting what he wanted through patience and pressure. The younger one was maybe 35, similar features suggesting they were related, his eyes scanning the property with the assessment of someone trained to notice details. Marcus stepped out before they could approach the office, positioning himself where he had clear retreat options if things went badly. Properties closed. Not taking visitors. Marcus Webb, the older man said, not quite a question. You look like your father. Same stubborn set to the jaw, same eyes that think they're smarter than everyone else. You knew Samuel? Knew him, worked with him, trusted him with something valuable that he decided to keep when he should have returned it. The man stepped closer, his movements deliberate. Name's Victor Brennan. This is my son Kyle. We've been waiting a long time for you to come home. Marcus kept his voice level despite his hammering heart. My father's letter said you'd come. Said you believed he owed you money that was actually his. Victor's expression hardened. Your father ran money through this lumber yard for 5 years in the 90s. We paid him well for that service, used the profits to invest in legitimate businesses. But Samuel got scared, decided he wanted out, and when we let him leave, he took with him $300,000 that belonged to us. Said he'd earned it, that it was his payment for services rendered. But payment had already been made. That money was ours. And my father claimed it was earnings from lumber sales he made legitimately after cutting ties with you. Convenient claim from a dead man. Kyle spoke for the first time, his voice carrying an edge his father's didn't. We've been watching this property for 8 years, waiting to see what happened to our investment. Samuel hid it somewhere, converted it to something we couldn't easily trace. But you're here now, and you found what he left. We want what's ours. Marcus thought about the offshore accounts in Samuel's name, about the documents that showed careful investment over 30 years, about his father's insistence that the money was legitimately earned. Even if what you're claiming is true, it was 30 years ago. Statute of limitations has run out. You've got no legal claim. Who said anything about legal claims? Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. This is about business ethics. About honoring agreements. About not stealing from people who remember and who don't forgive. So this is a threat. This is an opportunity for you to do the right thing. Return what Samuel stole, avoid complications that would make rebuilding your life difficult. Victor paused. You've got a daughter in Richmond. Emma, isn't it? Working as a barista, taking classes, trying to build something despite having a father in prison. Would be a shame if her life got complicated by your choices. The casual mention of Emma, the implicit threat, made something cold settle in Marcus's chest. You bring my daughter into this, you make an enemy who's got nothing to lose and 12 years of prison education and how to hurt people who deserve it. Kyle stepped forward, his posture aggressive, but Victor raised a hand to stop him. Nobody wants violence, Marcus. We're businessmen, not thugs. We just want what's ours. You've got 1 week to decide if you're going to do this the easy way or the hard way. After they left, Marcus stood in the lumber yard feeling the weight of his father's choices pressing down on him. Samuel had built something through compromise with dangerous people, had tried to extract himself and had apparently taken money in the process, had died before having to face the consequences. Now those consequences belonged to Marcus, along with everything else Samuel had left behind. He called Claire that evening, his voice tight with controlled anger. Did you know about Dad's past? About the people he worked with? Silence on the other end, the kind that confirmed she knew something. I knew there were rumors. That Dad had expanded the business faster than lumber sales alone would explain. But he never talked about it, and I never asked questions I didn't want answers to. Well, those people came to visit me today. They think Dad stole $300,000 from them, and they want it back. Did he? Steal it, I mean. Marcus thought about his father's letter, about the careful documentation of legitimate sales and investments. I don't know. He claimed he earned it honestly after cutting ties with them. But they've been waiting 8 years for me to lead them to it. They mentioned Emma, Claire. Threatened her indirectly but clearly. Jesus. Claire was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do? I'm going to talk to Emma. She deserves to know what's happening, deserves the choice about whether she wants anything to do with me or this situation. She might not take your call. I know. But I'm going to try anyway. He drove to Richmond the next morning, his parole officer having approved a day trip with the requirement that Marcus check in upon arrival. Emma's apartment was in a neighborhood that showed the kind of careful maintenance that came from people who didn't have much but took pride in what they had. Marcus sat in his truck across the street for 20 minutes, trying to find courage that had been easier to summon in prison when confrontation was abstract. Finally, he knocked on her door, his heart hammering harder than when Victor Brennan had threatened him. The door opened, and Emma stood there, 18 years old and so much like her mother that Marcus's breath caught. She'd been 6 when he'd gone to prison, a child. Now she was a young woman, and he'd missed every moment of that transformation. Emma. Marcus. She didn't call him Dad, and the formality of his first name hurt more than he'd expected. Claire said you might come. Can we talk? Please. I know I don't deserve your time, but there are things you need to know. She hesitated, then stepped aside to let him in. The apartment was small but tidy, the furniture mismatched but arranged with care. Evidence of a life built from nothing by someone who'd learned young that no one was going to build it for her. They sat at a small kitchen table, coffee between them like a buffer against 12 years of distance. Emma's posture was guarded, her expression carefully neutral, and Marcus recognized in her the same protective distance he'd perfected in prison. I read your letters, she said finally. All of them, even after I stopped responding. You apologized a lot. Explained things. Made promises about being better when you got out. I meant every word. I'm sure you did. But meaning words isn't the same as earning the right to say them. Emma's voice was steady, controlled. You went to prison when I was 6 years old. For 12 years, I grew up without a father. Mom tried, but she couldn't handle it, started drinking, eventually left too. I was raised by Aunt Claire and whatever strength I could find in myself. Your words don't change any of that. Marcus felt the weight of her anger and hurt, felt the justice of it settling onto shoulders that were already carrying too much. You're right. Nothing I say can fix what I did, what I cost you. But I'm here now, and there are things happening that might affect you, that you deserve to know about. He told her about the lumber yard, about Samuel's hidden legacy, about Victor Brennan's visit and the threat that had included her name. Emma listened with the focused attention of someone who'd learned to assess danger, to calculate risks, to protect herself because no one else would. So Grandpa Samuel was involved with criminals, and now they want money from you, and I'm leverage they can use to pressure you. Emma's voice was flat. That's what you came to tell me. I came to tell you that I'm going to handle this, that you don't need to be involved, but that you should be aware in case they try to approach you. Marcus leaned forward. I also came to tell you that I don't expect forgiveness or relationship. But if you're ever in trouble, if you ever need help, I'm here. That's not conditional on you accepting me back into your life. It's just true. Emma was quiet for a long time, her coffee going cold between them. Finally, she said, when you were arrested, I was 6. I didn't understand what was happening, just that one day you were there and then you weren't. Mom tried to explain, but how do you explain to a 6-year-old that her father chose to commit crimes that he knew could take him away from her? You can't. There's no explanation that makes that choice anything other than selfish and destructive. No, there isn't. Emma met his eyes, and Marcus saw in her expression something he recognized from mirrors in prison, the look of someone who'd survived things that should have broken them. I built a life without you. It's not much, but it's mine. I work 2 jobs, I'm taking classes, I'm making something of myself despite everything that happened. And I don't know if there's room in that life for a father who was absent for 12 years. I understand. And I'm not asking for room. I'm just asking that you know I'm here if you need me. After leaving Emma's apartment, Marcus drove back to Ashmont Ridge feeling hollowed out by the confrontation, by his daughter's justified anger, by the recognition that some damage couldn't be repaired just by wanting it to be. He'd lost 12 years with her, had missed her childhood and adolescence, had abandoned her to grow up with the stigma of having a father in prison. He found Claire waiting at the lumber yard when he returned, her expression troubled. Victor Brennan came to my house this afternoon. Very polite, very clear. Said you had 6 days left to make the right decision. They're escalating the pressure. They also left this. Claire handed him an envelope. Inside was a detailed financial breakdown showing how Samuel's lumber yard had expanded in the early 90s, how certain shipments had been priced significantly above market rates, how deposits that didn't match legitimate timber sales had flowed through the business accounts. At the bottom was a handwritten note, your father was a thief who got cold feet. You can choose to be better than he was by returning what was stolen, or you can choose his path and face his consequences. 6 days. Marcus spent that evening going through Samuel's records more carefully, comparing what Victor had provided with what his father had documented. The picture that emerged was complicated. Samuel had definitely moved money through the lumber yard, had definitely taken payment for services that weren't legal. But the $300,000 Victor claimed was stolen appeared to have come from legitimate lumber sales Samuel made after cutting ties with the Brennans, sales documented with contracts and shipping records that showed nothing illegal. Samuel's accounting was meticulous. Every board foot of lumber sold, every client who'd purchased premium hardwoods, every payment deposited and taxed. The money in the offshore accounts matched documented sales, showed a pattern of careful investment over 30 years, demonstrated nothing that looked like stolen funds hidden from view. Which meant either Samuel had been scrupulously honest in his later business dealings, or he'd been talented enough at cooking books to make illegal proceeds look legitimate. Marcus didn't know which, couldn't know for certain 3 decades later with only paper records and his father's written word to trust. On the 4th day after Victor's visit, Marcus found someone had broken into the climate-controlled container, had searched through the hardwood inventory looking for whatever they thought Samuel had hidden. They'd been careful, hadn't damaged the wood, had simply moved it systematically searching for false compartments or hidden spaces. They'd missed the false floor because Marcus had already removed the documents and stored them elsewhere, but their presence sent a clear message: patience was running out. He installed cameras, reinforced locks, made the container as secure as possible. But security only delayed inevitable confrontation. Victor wanted his money, believed he had legitimate claim to it, and wasn't going to accept refusal without making Marcus pay for that choice. The breaking point came on the 5th day, when Marcus received a call from Emma. Her voice was shaking, controlled rage barely contained. A man came to my work today. Older, polite, asked me questions about you. When I refused to engage, he left a note saying I should convince my father to do the right thing before people I cared about got hurt. Marcus felt cold fury settle over him, the kind that had gotten him in trouble before prison, that 12 years inside had taught him to control but never eliminated. Did he threaten you directly? No. But the implication was clear. Emma paused. What are you going to do? I'm going to make sure this doesn't touch you again. How? It was a fair question. Marcus had limited resources, was on parole, was dealing with people who had money and patience and no apparent fear of consequences. Fighting them directly would probably end badly. But surrendering would mean accepting their version of truth, would mean betraying Samuel's legacy if his father had actually earned that money honestly. I don't know yet, Marcus admitted. But I'm going to figure it out. That evening, he sat in his father's office surrounded by documents and decisions that seemed impossible, thinking about the lumber yard that had been Samuel's life, about the daughter who'd grown up without him, about dangerous men who believed they were owed something. The weight of inheritance pressed down, not just property and hidden money but consequences and conflicts that couldn't be resolved without someone losing something that mattered. The Virginia night settled over the lumber yard, heavy with humidity and the promise of storms. The pine trees that bordered the property whispered in the wind, remembering everything that had happened here, holding secrets that went deeper than Marcus could excavate with documents and accounting. His phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't recognize. The message was simple: 2 days left. Choose wisely. Marcus looked at the rare hardwoods his father had collected, at the documents showing careful business practices, at the financial statements that proved either legitimacy or elaborate fraud. Samuel had left him more than property. He'd left him a moral question with no clear answer, a fight with people who wouldn't forgive or forget, and a legacy that was equal parts burden and gift. The container stood in the darkness, its secrets partially revealed, its full truth still buried beneath layers of competing claims and old betrayals. Whatever Marcus decided in the next 2 days would determine not just his future but Emma's safety, would honor or betray his father's memory, would demonstrate whether 12 years in prison had taught him anything about making better choices when the stakes were impossibly high. The lumber yard waited, patient as only old land can be, ready to witness whatever came next in a conflict that had been waiting 8 years for Marcus Webb to come home and claim his inheritance. Marcus spent the night before Victor's deadline going through his father's records one more time, searching for something he might have missed, some piece of evidence that would prove Samuel's innocence or confirm his guilt. What he found instead was a letter tucked into the back of the journal, written but never sent, addressed to someone named Martin Kowalski. The letter was dated 1995, the year Samuel had apparently cut ties with the Brennans. In it, Samuel explained to this Martin person how he'd been documenting every transaction, every shipment, every penny that moved through the lumber yard during his years working with VC and his operation. Samuel wrote about keeping duplicate books, about creating an insurance policy in case Victor ever tried to claim Samuel had stolen from him. The letter ended with coordinates, GPS coordinates that didn't exist in 1995 but had been added in different ink, suggesting Samuel had updated this letter years later. Marcus entered the coordinates into his phone, finding they pointed to a location 3 miles into the pine forest that bordered the lumber yard's western edge. He waited until dawn, then hiked into the woods following the coordinates, finding himself at an old hunting cabin that was barely standing, its roof partially collapsed, its walls showing decades of weather damage. Inside the cabin, beneath a false floor similar to the one in the shipping container, Marcus found what Samuel had really left him. Not just documents, but recorded conversations on ancient cassette tapes, photographs of cash exchanges, ledgers that showed parallel accounting, one set of books for what the Brennans believed was happening, and another showing what Samuel had actually done. Samuel's voice came through the old tape player Marcus found with the materials, recording himself explaining the situation. If you're hearing this, Marcus, you found what I hoped you'd find. The money the Brennans claim I stole was never theirs. They were using my lumber yard to launder drug money, and I was helping them for a percentage. But I kept records of everything, and when I decided to get out, I used those records as leverage. Told Victor I'd kept evidence that would destroy him if he ever came after me or my family. Samuel's recorded voice continued, tired and resigned. I used the money I'd earned from them to build legitimate business. Sold premium lumber to high-end clients, invested carefully, created real wealth from dirty beginnings. The offshore accounts hold money from 30 years of honest work, but Victor will never believe that because he can't imagine someone actually going straight after being bent. The tape went on to explain that Samuel had given copies of all the evidence to Martin Kowalski, a federal agent who'd been investigating the Brennans in the 90s. Martin had promised to keep the evidence sealed as long as Samuel stayed clean and the Brennans didn't escalate. It was a standoff that had lasted until Samuel's death, and apparently Martin had passed away 2 years ago, taking his copy of the evidence with him. But I kept my copies, Samuel's voice said through the crackling recording. Kept them here where Victor would never find them, where only someone who really knew me would think to look. If the Brennans come after you, Marcus, give them the choice, walk away and live, or push harder and face prosecution for everything I documented. I died before I could make that choice, but you won't have to. Marcus sat in the ruined cabin listening to his father's voice, understanding that Samuel had been protecting his family even after death, had left insurance that would keep Victor at bay if Marcus was brave enough to use it. The question was whether evidence from the 90s would still have power, whether prosecutors would care about crimes that old, whether threatening Victor would end the conflict or just make it more dangerous. He spent the morning digitizing everything, the old cassette recordings and photographs, Samuel's duplicate ledgers showing illegal transactions documented with the kind of detail that destroyed criminal enterprises. Then he called Victor Brennan, his voice steady despite his racing heart. I found what my father left me. All of it. The recordings, the photographs, the parallel accounting that shows exactly what you were doing in the 90s. I've uploaded copies to multiple secure locations with instructions to release everything to federal prosecutors if anything happens to me or my family. Silence on the other end, the kind that confirmed Marcus had found something Victor hadn't expected to still exist. Your father promised that evidence was destroyed, Victor finally said, his voice tight with controlled anger. My father lied to protect us. Now I'm using that protection the way he intended. Walk away, and this stays buried. Come after me or Emma again, and I release everything. I don't care if the statute of limitations has passed on some of it. There's enough here to destroy your reputation, to bring scrutiny to your current businesses, to make the rest of your life very difficult. You're bluffing. Making threats you can't back up. Marcus read him a date and transaction amount from Samuel's records, details that only someone with access to the actual evidence would know. I can keep going. I've got recordings of you and my father discussing specific shipments, photographs of cash exchanges, ledgers that would give prosecutors a roadmap of your entire operation. Test me if you want. But I spent 12 years in prison learning patience and commitment. I will burn your life down if you threaten my family again. After hanging up, Marcus waited to see if Victor would call his bluff or believe the threat was real. The answer came that afternoon when a different number called, Victor's voice older and more tired than before. Your father was a careful man. More careful than I gave him credit for. He was protecting his family. Something you should have respected instead of trying to exploit. The money he took was earned legitimately after he cut ties with you. His records prove it, show every sale and every client. But even if you don't believe that, you're not getting it. Because the cost of taking it means facing prosecution, and that's a price you're not willing to pay. Victor was quiet for a long moment. You're right. I'm too old to spend my final years in court or prison. We're done here, Marcus. But understand this, you haven't won. You've just survived. There's a difference. After Victor hung up, Marcus sat in the lumber yard feeling the weight of his father's legacy settle into something approaching resolution. Samuel had made mistakes, had compromised with dangerous people, but he'd also protected his family and left Marcus the tools to finish that protection. It wasn't the inheritance Marcus had wanted or expected, but it was the one Samuel had been able to give. Emma came to the lumber yard 3 days later, her expression showing the careful neutrality that meant she was processing complicated emotions. Marcus watched her walk through the property, seeing how she studied the decay and the potential, how her eyes took in the rare hardwoods in the climate-controlled container with appreciation for their value. "Aunt Claire told me what happened with the Brennans. That you found evidence Grandpa Samuel kept, that you used it to protect us. I did what he set up for me to do." The hard part was keeping those records for 30 years, knowing they might be needed. Emma turned to face him, her expression showing struggle between the anger she'd carried for 12 years and something newer, more complicated. "When you went to prison, I thought you'd made selfish choices that destroyed our family. And you did. But seeing this, understanding what Grandpa Samuel was involved in, realizing the world you both operated in, it's more complicated than I let myself believe. That doesn't excuse what I did. Doesn't change that I chose crime over family, that I abandoned you when you needed me. No, it doesn't." Emma's voice was firm but not harsh. "But it helps me understand that you came from something broken, that maybe you were trying to escape what Grandpa Samuel built and ended up repeating it instead. That doesn't fix anything, but it makes you human instead of just the villain in my story." They stood together in the lumber yard's yard, 12 years of distance between them still, but something shifting in that distance, making it feel less permanent. "What are you going to do with this place?" Emma asked. "The lumber's valuable. You could sell it and start over somewhere else, build a life that isn't connected to all this history." Marcus had been thinking about that question since resolving the Brennan situation. The easy answer was to liquidate everything, take the money and disappear, build something new somewhere that didn't carry the weight of his and Samuel's mistakes. But standing here with his daughter, looking at the property his father had died protecting, he felt the pull of something else, the possibility of transformation rather than escape. "I think I want to rebuild it. Not as a lumber yard exactly, but as something that honors what it was while being something better. Use the rare hardwoods for custom work, maybe teach woodworking to people who need skills and second chances." Emma was quiet, considering this. That would take years. And money. And commitment to staying in one place when you could run. "I spent 12 years in a place I couldn't leave. Maybe I'm ready to choose a place I don't want to leave." Over the following months, Marcus began the slow work of transforming Webb Timber from abandoned ruin to functional workshop. He hired local contractors to repair the buildings, people who remembered Samuel and were willing to give his son a chance despite the prison record. The main shed became a woodworking space, equipped with tools Marcus purchased using careful portions of the money Samuel had invested offshore. The rare hardwoods became the foundation of a different kind of business. Marcus reached out to furniture makers and craftspeople, offering premium materials at fair prices, building relationships based on quality and reliability rather than the volume sales that had sustained traditional lumber yards. It was smaller, more personal, sustainable in ways the old operation never could have been. He also started a program teaching woodworking to men recently released from prison, understanding better than most how difficult re-entry was, how few opportunities existed for people with criminal records. The program was small at first, just 2 students, but it filled the workshop with the sound of work being learned, of men finding purpose in creating something with their hands. Emma visited occasionally, her presence becoming less strained, the conversations between them growing longer and more substantive. She didn't call him Dad, still kept that distance, but she stopped using his first name exclusively, started sometimes just saying you in ways that suggested relationship rather than formal detachment. "You're actually doing it," she said one afternoon, watching Marcus teach a student how to read wood grain, how to understand the material before trying to shape it. Building something that matters instead of just surviving. Trying to. Some days it feels impossible, like I'm one bad month from losing everything. But yeah, I'm trying. That's more than you were doing before you went to prison. More than Grandpa Samuel managed toward the end. Emma paused. "I'm not ready to have you be my father again. I don't know if I'll ever be ready for that. But I can respect what you're building here, can see you're trying to be better than you were." It was the closest thing to forgiveness Marcus had received, and he took it as the gift it was, Not absolution but acknowledgement that growth was possible, that people could change even if the damage they'd caused remained. The first year after his release was a steady grind of work and rebuilding, of small victories and frequent setbacks. The lumber yard slowly transformed from decay to purpose, the buildings repaired and functional, the grounds cleared and maintained, the space holding possibility where there'd been only abandonment. Claire visited regularly, helping with the administrative side of the business, connecting Marcus with resources for his re-entry program, slowly rebuilding the sibling relationship that had fractured when he'd gone to prison. They didn't talk much about the past, about the choices that had led Marcus to federal prison or Samuel's compromises with the Brennans. Instead, they focused on what could be built now, on creating something that honored their father's good qualities while leaving behind his mistakes. "Dad would be proud of this," Claire said one evening, watching Marcus close up the workshop after a long day. "Not the lumber yard exactly, but what you've made it mean. Second chances and honest work. That's what he wanted for you, even when he couldn't quite articulate it." Marcus thought about Samuel's letter, about his father's faith that Marcus would use the inheritance wisely, would build something that mattered. "He gave me the tools to do this. The money, yes, but also the evidence that kept the Brennans away. He protected me even after death, gave me space to be better than I was." 2 years after his release, Marcus attended Emma's community college graduation, sitting in the audience watching his daughter receive her associate degree with honors. She'd transferred to a 4-year university for the fall, studying business administration with plans to work in nonprofit management. Her life was solid, was built on her own strength and choices, had nothing to do with Marcus except in the ways his absence had forced her to be resilient. After the ceremony, Emma introduced him to her boyfriend, a young man who worked as a teacher and looked at Emma like she was remarkable, which she was. They all went to dinner together, the conversation awkward but genuine, Marcus understanding that he was being allowed to witness his daughter's life rather than participate in it, accepting that this might be as close as they ever got to reconciliation. "The workshop program is going well," Emma said during dinner, her tone suggesting she'd been following his progress through Claire's updates. "Aunt Claire says you've had 8 students so far, that 3 of them have found permanent employment doing skilled woodwork." "Yeah. It's small, but it's something. Gives men coming out of prison a chance to learn skills and build references, shows employers that rehabilitation is possible." Emma's boyfriend asked questions about the program, genuinely interested, and Marcus found himself explaining his vision for expanding it, for creating pathways for men who'd made mistakes to prove they could be more than their worst choices. It felt strange discussing this with his daughter's partner, felt like claiming expertise in redemption when Marcus was still figuring out his own path. But as dinner ended and they said goodbye, Emma hugged him briefly, her arms around him for maybe 3 seconds, and whispered, "I'm proud of what you're building. Keep doing it." 3 years after his release, Marcus received a letter from Kyle Brennan, Victor's son. The envelope contained a short note explaining that Victor had died of cancer, that in his final months he'd talked about Samuel Webb and the lumber yard, had expressed something that might have been regret about the decades-long conflict. "My father was stubborn and proud," Kyle wrote. "He convinced himself Samuel stole from us because accepting the alternative meant accepting he'd been wrong to harass your family for 40 years. But toward the end, he admitted he'd probably been chasing a ghost, making an enemy out of someone who just wanted to walk away from the life they'd shared. I'm writing to say I won't continue that fight. What happened between my father and yours died with them. I hope your rebuilding goes well." Marcus read the letter twice, feeling the weight of conflict finally releasing, of inherited anger ending because someone chose to let it end. He filed the letter with his father's documents, closing a chapter that had defined too much of his and Samuel's lives. The lumber yard continued its steady transformation, becoming known in regional woodworking communities as a source of premium materials and a training ground for craftspeople who needed second chances. Marcus hired 2 full-time instructors, expanded the program to include women coming out of prison, created partnerships with nonprofits focused on re-entry and rehabilitation. Emma finished her bachelor's degree and took a job with a nonprofit in Richmond that provided housing assistance to families in crisis. She visited the lumber yard quarterly, her presence becoming natural rather than strained, her conversations with Marcus deepening into something that resembled relationship if not quite the father-daughter bond they'd once had. "I've been thinking about what Grandpa Samuel left us," Emma said during one visit, for years after Marcus's release. "Not just the money or the lumber, but the lesson. About how you can come from something broken and still build something good, about how a legacy isn't what you inherit but what you choose to do with the inheritance." Marcus looked at his daughter, seeing in her the strength that had been forged by abandonment, by having to grow up too soon, by learning that people failed you but life continued anyway. "He gave us a complicated legacy. Criminal connections and honest work, protection and danger, wealth built on foundations that weren't entirely clean. But you're using it to create something that is clean," Emma said. "That's what matters. Not where it came from but what it becomes." The Virginia seasons rolled over the lumber yard, each one leaving its mark, each one building on what came before. The pine forest that bordered the property grew taller, witnessed the transformation of decay into purpose, held secrets in its roots about Samuel's hidden evidence and Victor's threats and all the conflicts that had shaped this ground. The workshop hummed with the sound of saws and sanders, with conversations between instructors and students, with the quiet satisfaction of people learning skills that gave them dignity in future. The rare hardwood Samuel had collected became furniture and art, became the raw material for beauty and function, became something that honored the craft Samuel had valued even as his business collapsed. Marcus turned 45 at the lumber yard, surrounded by students and staff, by Claire and Emma's fiancé, by people whose lives had been touched by the second chances this place offered. The celebration was modest but genuine, marked by appreciation for ground held and work done and the slow transformation of inheritance into legacy. As evening settled over Ashmont Ridge and the guests departed, Marcus stood alone in the workshop his father had built, feeling Samuel's presence in the careful construction, in the attention to detail that had allowed these buildings to survive decades of neglect. The lumber yard had been dying when Samuel kept it alive through stubbornness, had been dead when Marcus returned, had been reborn through choice and work in the understanding that some inheritances came with obligations that transcended personal benefit. The land kept its secrets, the cabin in the woods where evidence still sat protected, the places where dangerous men had threatened and eventually retreated, the moments of choice that had determined whether this place would be abandoned or reclaimed. But it had also given what mattered most, the space to build something meaningful, the opportunity to demonstrate that people could be more than their worst choices, the chance to honor a father's complicated legacy while creating something better. Webb Timber stood in the Virginia darkness, its lights glowing warm against the night, its purpose renewed through someone who'd spent 12 years in prison learning patience and then coming home to find that patience was exactly what rebuilding required. The workshop would open tomorrow, would teach and create, would offer second chances to people who'd made mistakes and wanted to prove those mistakes didn't define them permanently. That was legacy in its truest form, not what you inherited but what you built, not the mistakes of previous generations but the choice to do better, not the easy path of selling and escaping but the harder work of staying and transforming. Marcus had found that truth in a lumber yard his father died protecting, had claimed it through confronting dangerous men and making peace with his daughter's justified anger, had earned it through years of patient work that proved redemption was possible if you were willing to pay its price. The pine trees whispered in the wind, remembering everything, holding stories that connected Samuel's choices to Marcus's rebuilding to whatever would come next when Emma inherited this place and made her own decisions about what it meant. The land was patient, had seen families rise and fall and rise again, understood that legacy was built slowly across generations rather than claimed in single moments of triumph. Webb Timber would stand after Marcus was gone, would continue teaching and creating, would preserve knowledge about craft and second chances and the understanding that some inheritances came with burdens that could be transformed into gifts if you were brave enough to do the work. Samuel had built it, had protected it, had left tools for his son to reclaim it. Marcus had accepted that inheritance, had honored its complexity while choosing to build something better than what came before. That was enough. More than enough. It was legacy written in sawdust and careful joinery, in students who learned skills and found dignity, in a daughter who'd learned to respect if not quite forgive, in ground held through stubbornness meeting grace. The lumber yard stood as proof that what was broken could be mended, that what was abandoned could be reclaimed, that sometimes the hardest work was staying rather than running when running would have been easier. 15 years passed like seasons across the land, each one leaving its mark on Webb Timber the way water shapes stone. Marcus watched his body age in ways prison had prepared him for: patience with decline, acceptance of limitations, understanding that time took what it would take regardless of how carefully you guarded against loss. His hands bore arthritis now, made delicate work difficult, but they could still teach, could still guide students through the fundamentals of reading wood grain and respecting material. The lumber yard had transformed so completely that visitors who remembered Samuel's operation barely recognized it. The main shed housed a workshop that ran classes year-round, teaching traditional woodworking to people who needed skills and second chances. The equipment barn had become a showroom where finished pieces were displayed and sold, furniture and art created by students who'd learned their craft here. The office building where Samuel had died alone now held administrative staff managing a program that had grown beyond anything Marcus had imagined when he'd returned from prison with nothing but his father's hidden legacy. Emma visited on a warm Saturday in May, bringing her 2 children, Marcus's grandchildren, though he was still learning to claim that title without feeling he'd forfeited the right to it. Her daughter was 8, her son 6, both carrying Emma's serious eyes and her capacity for careful assessment of the world around them. They ran through the lumber yard with the freedom of children who knew they were safe, who'd been told this place belonged to their family in ways that meant something beyond ownership. "They're loud," Marcus said, watching his grandchildren explore the property with enthusiasm that made his chest tight. "They're kids," Emma corrected, her tone carrying affection rather than criticism. "Let them be loud. This place has been quiet too long." She was 43 now, carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd built a life through her own strength and choices. Her work with housing nonprofits had evolved into leadership positions, her voice respected in conversations about poverty and systemic barriers to stability. She'd married a good man who treated her children with the kind of patient attention Marcus had failed to give her, had built something Marcus could only witness from the outside, grateful to be allowed even that proximity. "How's the program expansion going?" Emma asked, watching her children discover the climate-controlled container where premium hardwoods were still stored and maintained. "Good. We're partnering with 3 more prisons now, offering pre-release training so people have skills before they're out. Makes the transition easier, gives them something to build toward." Marcus paused. "We've trained over 200 people in 15 years. About 60% find permanent employment in woodworking or related fields. The rest at least have skills and references. Dad would be proud of that." It still surprised Marcus when Emma called Samuel Dad, claimed that relationship when she'd never called Marcus anything but his first name. He'd accepted years ago that he was Marcus to her, would probably always be Marcus, that the title Dad was reserved for the father who'd been present rather than the one who'd returned after 12 years in prison. "Samuel left me the tools to do it," Marcus said. "The money, the lumber, the lesson about how you could come from something broken and still build something good. I just followed the blueprint he couldn't quite complete." Emma was quiet for a moment, watching her children with the kind of careful attention mothers who'd survived difficult childhoods brought to parenting. "I've been thinking about what to tell them about you. About your history. They're getting old enough to start asking questions about why they didn't meet you until they were born." Marcus felt the familiar ache of consequences that couldn't be undone, choices that echoed across generations. "Tell them the truth. That I made terrible choices when I was younger, that I went to prison, that I missed your entire childhood because of my mistakes. They should know that actions have consequences that last longer than you expect. I plan to tell them that. But I also want to tell them what you built after. How you came back to something abandoned and made it meaningful. How you've given hundreds of people second chances because you understand what it means to need one." Emma met his eyes. "You don't get to be just a mistake, Marcus. You also get to be the person who spent 15 years proving people can change if they do the work." The workshop program had become Marcus's legacy in ways the lumber yard itself never could be. Students who'd trained there sent photographs of their work, furniture they'd built for clients or families, proof that skills learned at Webb Timber translated to real life and real income. Some returned to teach, creating continuity that ensured the program would survive beyond Marcus's ability to run it. Claire had died 3 years ago, cancer that moved quickly and took her before Marcus had fully processed she was dying. Her death had gutted him in ways he hadn't anticipated, losing the sister who'd held the family together when both he and Samuel had been absent or inadequate. Emma had delivered the eulogy, had spoken about an aunt who'd raised her when both parents had failed in different ways, had honored Claire with the kind of love Marcus wished he'd earned. Standing at Claire's grave, Marcus had understood with terrible clarity how much time had passed, how many of the people who'd shaped his early life were gone. Samuel dead for 15 years, Claire newly buried, the Brennans either dead or moved on, the conflicts and struggles that had defined his 30s feeling like stories from someone else's life. But the lumber yard remained. The land persisted. The workshop continued teaching people that their worst choices didn't have to define them permanently. That was Claire's legacy as much as Samuel's or Marcus's, the understanding that family meant showing up even when showing up was difficult, that love sometimes meant holding ground for people who couldn't hold it themselves. On an evening in late September, Marcus stood in the workshop after the day's students had left, running his arthritic hands over the workbench Samuel had built in the 70s. The wood was worn smooth by decades of use, bore marks from tools and mistakes and the countless projects that had been created here. Samuel's hands had shaped this bench, had taught Marcus on it during the summers before everything went wrong, had probably touched it in his final days when the lumber yard was dying and Samuel was dying with it. A knock on the workshop door pulled Marcus from his thoughts. A young man stood there, maybe 30, wearing the careful neutrality of someone who'd spent time in prison and learned to mask emotions that might be used against him. "Mr. Webb? I'm Tyler Grant. I trained here 6 years ago, in the 3rd cohort. You probably don't remember me." Marcus did remember, vaguely. A quiet student who'd learned quickly, who'd been in prison for drug charges similar to what had sent Marcus away. "I remember. You built a dining table for your final project. Cherry wood, traditional joinery." Tyler's face showed surprise and gratitude that he'd been remembered. "I'm running my own small woodworking business now in Norfolk. Nothing huge, but it's sustainable. I employ 2 people, both former students from other reentry programs." He paused. "I came because I wanted to tell you in person that this place saved my life. Not dramatically, not in the sense that I would have died without it. But in the sense that it gave me a future when I thought I'd used up all my chances." Marcus felt emotion tighten his throat, the kind that came from witnessing the ripples of choices extending beyond your ability to track them. That's the point of it. Giving people chances when the world tells them they've run out. "My daughter asked me yesterday what I do for work," Tyler continued. "I gotta tell her I build furniture, that I create things with my hands that people value. That's a gift, Mr. Webb. Getting to tell my kid I make things instead of having to explain why I was absent during her early years. So thank you for seeing worth in people the world wrote off." After Tyler left, Marcus stood in the workshop feeling the weight of 15 years of teaching, of second chances given and taken, of students who'd built lives because someone had invested in their potential. This was what Samuel's compromised money had purchased, not just Marcus's survival but the survival of hundreds of people who'd needed someone to believe they could be more than their mistakes. Emma called that evening, her voice carrying the warmth that came after years of slowly rebuilt trust. "The kids want to have Thanksgiving at the lumber yard this year. Something about showing their friends where you work, making it a big family thing." "You sure? It's just a workshop and some old buildings. Not exactly traditional Thanksgiving atmosphere. It's where our family rebuilt itself. Where Samuel's legacy became something good despite coming from something complicated. That seems pretty traditional to me." Emma paused. "Besides, Marcus, you're 62 years old. How many more Thanksgivings do you get to claim with grandchildren before they're too old to want to spend holidays with family?" The question hit exactly as Emma had intended. Marcus had lost 12 years with her, had missed her childhood entirely, had forfeited the right to take time for granted. His grandchildren were young now, still thought spending time at the lumber yard was interesting, still wanted to learn about wooden tools and the way their grandfather's hands could shape raw material into something useful. "Okay," Marcus said. "Thanksgiving at the lumber yard. I'll clean up the workshop, make it presentable. Don't clean it too much. The sawdust and tool marks are part of what makes it real." Thanksgiving brought Emma's family and the families of 3 current students, turning the workshop into something between celebration and affirmation of community. The children ran through the lumber yard exploring while adults shared food and stories, the workshop filled with conversation and laughter and the comfortable chaos of people who'd found connection through shared purpose. Marcus watched his grandson attempt to use a hand plane under careful supervision, the 8-year-old's face showing intense concentration as wood shavings curled away from the blade. Samuel had taught Marcus this same skill 40 years ago, had stood behind him guiding his hands, had been patient with mistakes and generous with praise when Marcus got it right. "You're a natural," Marcus told his grandson, seeing in the boy's careful attention the same focus Emma had shown as a child, the same determination to do things properly that had defined Samuel's entire approach to craft. "Can I come learn here?" the boy asked. "When I'm old enough." "You can come learn anytime. The workshop's always open to family." As evening settled and guests departed, Emma lingered, helping Marcus clean up the workshop while her husband took the children home. They worked in companionable silence, the kind that existed between people who'd survived complicated history and found their way to something resembling peace. "You've built something good here," Emma said, putting away the last of the dishes. "Not perfect, not uncomplicated, but good. That matters more than you probably realize. I had advantages most people returning from prison don't have. The property, the money Samuel left, the rare hardwoods that gave me capital to start with. Without those things, I probably would have ended up back inside. Maybe. Or maybe you would have found another way, because that's what you spent 15 years proving you could do, find ways when none seemed obvious." Emma paused. "I'm not ready to call you Dad. I don't know if I'll ever be ready for that. But I can say you're a good man who made terrible choices and spent the rest of your life trying to balance the scales. That's worth something." After Emma left, Marcus walked the lumber yard's perimeter as he did most evenings, checking locks and security, looking at property that had been in his family for 3 generations and had survived because people had been stubborn enough to hold it when letting go would have been easier. The pine forest that bordered the western edge whispered in the November wind, the same trees that had witnessed Samuel's hidden evidence and Victor Brennan's threats, that had grown taller while Marcus served his sentence and returned to rebuild. The land kept its secrets, the cabin where documents still sat protected though no longer needed, the places where dangerous men had once threatened violence, the countless small moments of choice that had determined whether this place would be abandoned or reclaimed. But it had also given what mattered most, space to build something meaningful, time to prove that people could change, opportunity to demonstrate that inheritance was about choice rather than obligation. Marcus turned 70 with ceremony that felt simultaneously significant and ordinary, students and former students gathering to honor a man who'd spent 2 decades teaching them that skills and second chances could combine into dignity in future. Emma's children were teenagers now, old enough to understand their grandfather's history, to know he'd been in prison and to ask questions about what that meant. He told them the truth as Emma had once told him to do, that he'd made selfish choices in his 30s, had valued money and excitement over family and responsibility, had paid for those choices with 12 years in federal prison. But he also told them about Samuel, about discovering hidden money in rare hardwoods, about choosing to build something that honored his father's complicated legacy while being something better. "So you were a criminal?" his grandson asked with the bluntness of 16-year-olds who hadn't yet learned to soften difficult questions. "Yes. For a period of my life, I was a criminal. I sold drugs, helped move illegal shipments, made money in ways that hurt people and communities. Then I got caught and served my time." "But you're not a criminal anymore." "No. Now I'm someone who made terrible choices and has spent 20 years trying to do better. Whether that makes me redeemed or just less bad is something each person has to decide for themselves." His granddaughter, 18 and preparing for college, asked something harder. "Do you regret it?" Not just getting caught, but the choices themselves? Marcus thought about the question, about 12 years in prison and 18 years of Emma calling him by his first name, about missing her entire childhood and only being allowed to witness his grandchildren's from the periphery. Yes. I regret every choice that led to prison, every moment I chose myself over the people who needed me to be better. I can't undo those choices, can only try to build something meaningful with the time I have left. The workshop program had trained over 400 people by Marcus's 75th birthday, had established satellite programs in 6 states, had become recognized as a model for re-entry services. Emma had joined the board 5 years earlier, bringing her nonprofit experience and her commitment to helping people who'd survived systems designed to punish rather than rehabilitate. Marcus stepped back from daily teaching, his body no longer capable of the physical work woodworking required, his hands too arthritic to demonstrate techniques properly. But he remained involved in program design, in fundraising, in the careful work of ensuring Webb Timber would continue after he was gone. On a warm evening in late May, 33 years after Marcus had walked out of Harding Correctional with everything he owned in a canvas bag, he sat on the porch of the house he'd built beside the workshop, watching the sun set over the lumber yard Samuel had died protecting. The property hummed with quiet activity even in evening stillness, night classes in the workshop, the climate-controlled storage where premium hardwoods were maintained, the grounds where decades of careful attention had transformed decay into purpose. Emma sat beside him, gray showing in her hair now, her face bearing the lines that came from 6 decades of living, of surviving difficult childhood and building stable adulthood, of making peace with history that couldn't be changed. "You've done what Samuel asked," Emma said quietly. "Used his inheritance better than he managed to. Built something that will outlive you, that will keep helping people long after you're gone." Marcus thought about his father's letter, about the faith Samuel had placed in a son who'd been in prison, about the tools and resources that had made redemption possible when redemption had seemed impossible. "He gave me a complicated gift. Money from morally questionable sources, lumber purchased with profits from a dying business, property that came with dangerous enemies attached. But he also gave me trust, gave me space to be better than I'd been, gave me examples of both what to do and what not to do. That's what parents give their children if they're honest. The complicated truth of who they were, the space to choose whether to repeat or transform that inheritance." The lumber yard stood in the gathering darkness, its buildings solid against the Virginia night, its purpose renewed through decades of patient work. The workshop lights glowed warm through windows, students learning skills that would translate to dignity and income, to the ability to tell their children they created things rather than explaining absences caused by incarceration. Samuel's voice echoed across the years, remembered words from childhood summers when Marcus had worked here learning craft. "Good lumber carries the story of how it grew, every knot and grain line tells you something about what that tree survived." People are like that too. The hard years show in who they become, but showing hard years isn't the same as being broken beyond use. Marcus understood now what his father had meant, what Samuel had been trying to teach before everything went wrong. That survival left marks, that mistakes became part of the grain, that the goal wasn't to hide damage but to use the whole board including its flaws to build something that mattered. The pine trees whispered in the night wind, holding stories that connected Samuel's struggles to Marcus's rebuilding to whatever would come when Emma inherited this land and made her own choices about what it meant. The forest was patient, had witnessed families rise and fall and rise again, understood that legacy was measured in generations rather than individual lives. Webb Timber would stand after Marcus was gone, would continue teaching and creating, would preserve his father's complicated gift and Marcus's patient transformation of that gift into something unmistakably good. The workshops would hum with saws and sanders, with conversations between teachers and students, with the quiet satisfaction of people learning they could be more than their worst choices if someone believed in their potential. That was legacy in its truest form, not the property or the money or the rare hardwoods, but the understanding that some inheritances came with obligations that transcended personal benefit, that required choosing to build rather than simply to possess, that demanded patience and commitment and the stubborn belief that transformation was possible even when evidence suggested otherwise. The land breathed in the darkness, alive with purpose and memory, bearing witness to everything that had happened here, Samuel's compromises and protection, Marcus's crimes and redemption, Emma's survival and strength, the hundreds of students who'd found dignity in this place when dignity seemed beyond reach. Marcus sat beside his daughter watching stars emerge in patterns that had looked down on this land before Samuel bought it, before Marcus went to prison and returned, before any of the human struggles that had shaped this place. They'd continue after everyone currently alive was gone, patient witnesses to the slow work of people choosing daily to honor their best impulses rather than surrender to their worst. The lumber yard stood as proof that what was broken could be mended, that what was complicated could be honored, that sometimes the hardest work was staying rather than leaving when leaving would have been easier. Samuel had built it, had protected it with choices both admirable and questionable, had left tools for his son to reclaim it. Marcus had accepted that inheritance, had spent 33 years transforming it from personal salvation into community resource, had learned that redemption was possible if you were willing to pay its price in patient, daily commitment to being better than you'd been. That was enough. More than enough. It was legacy written in sawdust and student success, in a daughter who'd learned to respect if not quite forgive, in grandchildren who knew their grandfather's history and saw him choosing daily to honor the good while acknowledging the bad. The lumber yard would endure, would continue giving second chances, would preserve the understanding that people were like good lumber, their hard years showed in the grain, but that grain could be worked with and built upon if you approached it with proper respect and patient skill. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.